Ibrahim was everything I ever wanted in a husband: caring, attentive, and always putting my needs first, despite his demanding job as a business executive. When he asked me to be a full-time housewife, I hesitated at first, but his love and devotion made the decision easier. I had no complaints. He provided everything I needed and more. For the first few years, our marriage was bliss. Ibrahim would come home after long hours at work and still find time to shower me with affection. Our weekends were filled with laughter, spontaneous trips, and long conversations about our future. I felt cherished, adored even. But everything changed when I got pregnant with our first child. At first, I thought it was just my hormones playing tricks on me. I tried to reason that Ibrahim was only being cautious, afraid that any stress might harm the baby. But as my belly grew, so did the distance between us. The man who once held me close every night now barely noticed my presence. His once passionate kisses turned into quick pecks on the forehead. The late-night talks faded, replaced by silent dinners and nights where he claimed exhaustion and retreated to bed early. I told myself it was temporary. That once the baby arrived, things would return to normal. But deep down, fear gnawed at my heart. Was I no longer attractive to him? Did he regret marrying me now that I carried the weight of our unborn child? I tried everything, dressing up in his favorite outfits, cooking his favorite meals, even initiating conversations that once excited him. But his responses were lukewarm at best. His eyes, which once sparkled with admiration when he looked at me, now held nothing but indifference. One evening, as I set the table for dinner, I finally found the courage to ask, "Ibrahim, is something wrong? Have I done something to upset you?" He barely looked up from his phone. "You're imagining things, Amina. I've just been busy." Busy. The word felt like a slap. Was I no longer worth his time? Tears threatened to spill, but I swallowed them back. I refused to be the nagging wife. I convinced myself that once the baby arrived, everything would be fine. But deep inside, I feared that I had already lost him.
The days turned into weeks, and my belly grew rounder, heavier with the life Ibrahim and I had created. But instead of bringing us closer, it felt like a wedge had been driven between us. And now, a new challenge emerged, one I hadn't expected. My body craved Ibrahim more than ever. I had heard that pregnancy could heighten a woman's desire, but nothing prepared me for the intensity of my longing. My skin burned with need whenever he was near, my heart raced at the thought of his touch. But the worst part? Ibrahim was completely oblivious. Each night, I would slide closer to him in bed, hoping for just a brush of his fingers against my skin, some sign that he still desired me. But he would either turn away or pretend not to notice. One evening, determined to break the ice, I took extra time getting ready for bed. I wore a silk nightgown that hugged my curves in all the right places. As I stepped into the dimly lit bedroom, Ibrahim sat at the edge of the bed, typing away on his laptop. I hesitated before walking over and gently placing a hand on his shoulder. "Can we talk?" I whispered, my voice laced with hope. He sighed, closing his laptop. "What is it, Amina?" I took a deep breath, my fingers trailing down his arm. "I miss you, Ibrahim. I miss us." His body tensed beneath my touch. "Amina, not now. I'm tired." Frustration bubbled inside me. Not now. It was never now. I pulled back, my throat tightening. "I feel like I'm invisible to you. You act like I'm just a burden." His jaw clenched, and he ran a hand over his face. "That's not true. I'm just trying to focus on work and what?" I cut in, my voice shaking. "Because ever since I got pregnant, you've barely touched me, barely looked at me." Silence. I waited, hoping for an explanation, an apology, anything. But all he did was exhale and climb into bed, turning his back to me. Tears blurred my vision. I lay beside him, staring at the ceiling, my heart aching with loneliness. Ibrahim was right next to me, but I had never felt so far away from him. The distance between Ibrahim and me stretched wider with each passing day, like a river carving an unbridgeable gap between two shores. Every night, I lay beside him, longing for his touch, his warmth, anything to remind me that I was still his wife, still a woman he desired. But all I got was silence and cold shoulders. Then, George came back into my life. It started as a simple phone call. A familiar voice from my past, one that instantly transported me back to my university days. Amina. His laughter rang through the phone. I was just telling my wife about you yesterday. The woman who saved my career. I smiled for the first time in what felt like weeks. Oh, come on, George. You got that job on your own merit. I only pointed you in the right direction. And what a direction it was, he chuckled. Imagine my surprise when I found out Ibrahim was my new boss. Small world, huh? We talked for nearly an hour, reminiscing about old times, laughing about our struggles as students, and sharing updates on our lives. George was happily married with 2 kids, and I found comfort in the ease of our conversation. At first, I told myself it was harmless. But as the days went by, I found myself looking forward to his calls, his text messages, the occasional chats about his work and how demanding Ibrahim could be. It felt good to have someone genuinely see me again. Someone who asked, "How are you, Amina?" and actually waited for the answer. Then one afternoon he asked, "Hey, are you free to meet for lunch? I'm in your neighborhood for a meeting." I hesitated. Would it be wrong? But then I thought of Ibrahim, of the countless nights I had reached out for him only to be met with indifference. "Sure," I said softly. "I'd love to." As I dressed for lunch, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror. For the first time in months, I felt alive again. My heart beat a little faster. My skin tingled with excitement. And as I stepped out the door, I ignored the small voice in my head warning me that I was walking a dangerous path. I arrived at the quiet restaurant a few minutes early, my heart pounding harder than it should. I told myself it was just lunch with an old friend, nothing more. But as soon as George walked in, flashing that familiar boyish grin, a warmth spread through me, something I hadn't felt in a long time. "Amina," he greeted, pulling me into a brief but firm hug. "You look amazing." His words sent a thrill through me. How long had it been since someone, not out of politeness but genuine admiration, told me I looked beautiful? "Thank you," I said, settling into my seat. "It's good to see you again." As we ate, conversation flowed easily, just like it used to in our university days. We talked about our families, our past struggles, and the pressures of life. He spoke about his wife and kids with affection, but I noticed the flicker of something in his eyes, something I recognized. "So," George said, after a pause, his gaze studying me closely. "How's married life?" The question hit harder than it should have. I forced a smile. "Good." His eyebrows lifted slightly, a knowing expression settling on his face. That didn't sound convincing. I exhaled, swirling the juice in my glass. "It's just complicated." "Complicated how?" I hesitated. Was it appropriate to spill my heart out to him? But then again, George had always been a safe space, a friend who listened without judgment. And for the first time in months, I wanted to be heard. "Ibrahim is different now," I admitted. "Ever since I got pregnant, it's like I don't exist to him anymore. He's distant, distracted, and no matter what I do, I can't seem to get his attention." George leaned forward, his expression turning serious. "Amina, I don't know Ibrahim that well outside of work, but I do know this: you deserve to feel loved. Pregnancy is supposed to be a time when your husband supports you the most, not when he pulls away." His words touched a nerve, and before I could stop myself, I reached for his hand across the table. It was meant to be a casual touch, a friendly gesture, but when our fingers brushed, something electric passed between us. For a moment, neither of us moved. George swallowed, his jaw tightening slightly as if he, too, felt it. Then he gently pulled his hand back, clearing his throat. "I'm here for you, Amina. Always." The words shouldn't have meant so much, but they did. They filled the empty spaces Ibrahim had left behind. As we parted ways, I knew I had crossed an invisible line. I hadn't done anything wrong yet, but I felt the shift. A door had been opened, and I wasn't sure if I had the strength to close it. And deep down, I wasn't sure if I wanted to. That lunch with George awakened something in me, something I wasn't ready to admit. It wasn't just about the attention he gave me or the warmth in his eyes when he spoke. It was the way he saw me, the way he listened. With Ibrahim, I had become invisible, but with George, I felt like a woman again. I tried to push the feelings aside, telling myself it was just the nostalgia of reconnecting with an old friend. But the truth was, I started looking forward to his calls, his texts, the little moments that made me feel less alone. Then one evening, as I sat on the couch scrolling mindlessly through my phone, Ibrahim walked in. His presence barely registered anymore. He had made it clear that work came first, and I had stopped expecting more. But something in his expression caught my attention. "I saw you today," he said flatly. I looked up, my heart skipping a beat. "Saw me?" He nodded, unbuttoning his cuffs, his gaze sharp. "At the restaurant. With George." My stomach twisted. I hadn't expected this. He was just in the area for a meeting, so we had lunch. It was nothing. Ibrahim's lips pressed into a thin line. He stared at me for a long moment before exhaling sharply. "I don't have time for games, Amina." Anger flared in me. Games? Was that what he thought this was? Did he think I was just some bored housewife looking for attention? "Ibrahim, do you even hear yourself?" I shot back. "You've ignored me for months. Months. And now, suddenly, you care because I had lunch with an old friend." His jaw tightened. A married woman having secret meetings with another man? What am I supposed to think? I laughed bitterly, standing up. "Secret? I told you the truth. And if you had been paying attention to me all these months, maybe I wouldn't have needed someone else to remind me that I still matter." The words hung between us, heavy and sharp. For the first time in a long while, I saw something flicker in Ibrahim's eyes. Regret? Guilt? But just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by that same cold indifference. He shook his head, picked up his briefcase, and walked toward the bedroom without another word. I stood there, heart pounding, tears stinging my eyes. A part of me wanted him to turn around, to fight for me, to see me, but he didn't. And as I wiped my eyes and picked up my phone, my fingers hovered over George's name. A line had already been crossed. I just wasn't sure if I cared anymore. That night, sleep eluded me. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. Ibrahim had seen me with George, yet even after confronting me, he still hadn't tried. No apology, no effort to understand, no sign that he cared beyond the bruised male ego of catching his wife in another man's company. I had waited for him to reach for me, to hold me, to fight for me, but he never did. By morning, my mind was made up. I picked up my phone, hesitating only briefly before sending George a message. "Are you free today? I need to talk." It didn't take long for his reply to come in. "George, of course. Want to meet somewhere?" I bit my lip, my pulse quickening. A public place felt unnecessary. Can you come over?" I stared at the screen, waiting, almost afraid of what his response would mean. When the 3 little dots appeared, my heart pounded. "George, I'll be there in an hour." I put my phone down, exhaling shakily. Was I making a mistake? Maybe. But all I knew was that I needed someone, and Ibrahim had made it clear he wouldn't be that person. I spent the next hour fussing over my appearance. Nothing too obvious, but enough to remind myself that I was still desirable. When the doorbell rang, a nervous thrill ran through me. I opened the door, and there he was. George stood there, dressed casually in jeans and a button-down, his eyes immediately scanning my face, as if reading every unspoken emotion. He smiled, but there was something cautious in his gaze. "Hey," he said softly. "Hey," I replied, stepping aside to let him in. As he entered, his cologne filled the air, stirring something deep inside me. This wasn't just a friendly visit. We both knew it. I led him to the living room, suddenly unsure how to start. But George was perceptive. He sat beside me, close but not too close, his voice gentle. "Amina, what's going on?" I swallowed hard, my fingers twisting in my lap. "Ibrahim saw us yesterday." George didn't look surprised. And I shook my head, frustration bubbling up. And nothing. He confronted me, accused me of meeting you in secret, but then he just walked away. No anger, no jealousy, no attempt to fix what's broken. He doesn't care, George. A shadow passed over his face. Of course he cares. Maybe he just doesn't know how to show it. I scoffed. How do you explain months of neglect? Of making me feel unwanted? A man who truly cares doesn't just let go like this. Silence stretched between us, thick with emotions neither of us dared to name. Then George reached for my hand, his touch warm, grounding. You're not unwanted, Amina. Not by everyone. My breath hitched. I should have pulled away, should have reminded myself that George was married, that this was dangerous. But I didn't. I let my fingers rest in his, let the heat of his palms seep into my skin. George, my voice was barely a whisper. His eyes darkened, flickering to my lips, then back to my eyes. Tell me to leave, and I will, he murmured. But if you need someone, I'm here. I didn't speak. I couldn't, because for the first time in a long time I felt wanted, and I wasn't sure if I was strong enough to walk away from that. The air between us was thick with something undeniable, something dangerous. George's hand in mine was warm, steady, familiar, and yet it sent a thrill through me that I knew I had no right to feel. I looked up, and our eyes locked. His gaze held a longing that mirrored my own, a silent understanding passing between us. He wasn't just being kind, he wanted me. And for the first time in months, I felt like a woman again, not just a forgotten wife or a mother-to-be. Slowly, George lifted his free hand, his fingers grazing my cheek. It was the kind of touch I had been craving from Ibrahim, the kind that whispered, I see you, I want you. Amina, he murmured, his voice husky. My breath hitched as he leaned in, his lips hovering just inches from mine. The logical part of me screamed to stop this before it went too far, but my body betrayed me, drawn to the warmth, the comfort, the desire that radiated from him. Then, just as our lips were about to meet, a sharp jolt of realization crashed through me. What am I doing? I pulled back abruptly, my heart pounding, my breathing uneven. George, we can't. His hand fell away, but he didn't look angry, only conflicted, as if he, too, was battling something deep inside him. Amina, he exhaled, raking a hand through his hair. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. I shook my head, forcing a smile that felt more like a plea for control.
No.
Don't apologize. I let this go too far. A heavy silence settled between us. I get it, he said finally, his voice softer now. You're lonely. And if I'm being honest, so am I. His confession sent a fresh wave of emotion crashing over me.
So am I.
But that didn't make this right. I stood up, needing space, needing air. I think you should go. For a moment, I thought he would argue, but instead, he nodded. He stood too, hesitating before placing a gentle hand on my shoulder. You're stronger than you think, Amina, he said. But if you ever need a friend, I'm here. I swallowed the lump in my throat and managed a small nod. As he walked to the door and stepped out, I closed my eyes, exhaling shakily. I had resisted, but as I placed a hand on my growing belly, a cold truth settled in my heart. Ibrahim had pushed me away, and sooner or later, if nothing changed, I wasn't sure if I'd be strong enough to resist again. After George left, I stood by the door for a long time, my fingers still tingling from his touch. The storm of emotions inside me refused to settle. Guilt, relief, longing, and something even more dangerous. Doubt. Had I really stopped myself because I believed in my marriage? Or was it just fear? Fear of crossing a line I could never come back from? Ibrahim had no idea how close I had come to betraying him. And the painful truth? A part of me wanted him to know. Maybe then he would finally see me. But Ibrahim was as distant as ever. That night, as I lay beside him in bed, the silence between us felt unbearable. He was scrolling through his phone, as if my presence beside him was nothing more than an afterthought. I turned to face him. Ibrahim. He didn't look up. I hesitated, suddenly unsure of what I even wanted to say. That I had almost kissed another man? That I felt invisible? That I was drowning in loneliness? Instead, I settled for something simpler. Are we okay? He finally put his phone down, exhaling like my question was an inconvenience. What do you mean? I swallowed hard. You barely talk to me anymore. You barely touch me. I need to know if we're okay. His jaw tensed. Amina, I've been busy. Work is stressful, and now with the baby coming, I have a lot on my mind. I nodded slowly, absorbing his words, but they felt hollow. He wasn't lying, but he wasn't telling the truth either. I reached for his hand, desperate for some connection. I miss you. For a moment, I thought he would respond. His fingers twitched in mine, his expression unreadable. But then, just as quickly, he pulled away. I'm tired, Amina. Let's not do this tonight. And just like that, the conversation was over. I turned away from him, biting my lip to keep the tears at bay. I had resisted George, thinking it was the right thing to do. But how long could I keep resisting when the man I had vowed to love was slowly pushing me into another's arms? As I lay in the darkness, one thought haunted me. If Ibrahim didn't start fighting for our marriage soon, I wasn't sure I'd have the strength to keep fighting for it alone. The following afternoon, I sat on the veranda, sipping a cold glass of juice, my mind heavy with thoughts of Ibrahim, George, and the growing void in my marriage. The loneliness was suffocating, an ache that refused to go away. Then, the low hum of a lawnmower filled the air. I glanced toward the garden and froze. The new gardener, a tall, well-built man with dark skin glistening under the afternoon sun, was pushing the mower across the grass. His shirt had been discarded, tucked into the waistband of his trousers, revealing a sculpted chest that glistened with sweat. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. I wasn't usually the type to ogle men, but something about the raw masculinity before me, strong arms flexing with each movement, muscles rippling under the sun, captivated me in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. I shifted in my seat, a strange heat spreading through me. What is wrong with me? I had never been the kind of woman to let her eyes wander. But maybe it wasn't about him. Maybe it was about me. About feeling something again, about remembering that I was still a woman with desires, even if my husband had forgotten that. For a brief, dangerous moment, I let my mind drift. I imagined the gardener turning around, catching me watching him, his lips curving into a knowing smile as he slowly walked toward me, sweat glistening on his bare chest. He would lean in, his deep voice teasing. Like what you see, ma'am? A shiver ran through me. I shook my head quickly, snapping out of the fantasy, ashamed of myself. This wasn't me. I wasn't some desperate woman thirsting over strangers. And yet, as I forced my gaze away, my pulse still raced. Was this who I was becoming? A woman whose loneliness made her vulnerable to any man who showed even the slightest appeal? I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath. This needed to stop. Whatever was happening inside me, this hunger, this craving, it wasn't the answer. I needed to talk to Ibrahim, to fight for my marriage before I lost myself completely. But as I stood up and went inside, one troubling thought remained. What if I was already too far gone? I spent the rest of the day trying to shake off the lingering heat of my thoughts. The fantasy had been fleeting, a moment of weakness, but it haunted me more than it should have. It wasn't just about the gardener or even George, it was about what they represented. Attention. Desire. The things Ibrahim no longer gave me. As I prepared dinner, I kept glancing at my phone, debating whether to text George. I missed the way he made me feel seen, but after what almost happened, I knew that path was dangerous. Ibrahim came home late, as usual. He barely acknowledged me before heading straight to the bedroom. I followed him, determined to bridge the growing gap between us. Ibrahim, I called softly, watching as he loosened his tie. He let out a tired sigh. What is it, Amina? I hesitated but pushed forward. We need to talk. His shoulders tensed. About what? I swallowed, trying to keep my emotions in check. About us. About how distant you've been. I feel like I'm living with a stranger. Ibrahim turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "Amina, I'm doing my best. I work long hours to provide for you and the baby. Can't that be enough?" "No," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. "It's not enough. I need my husband, not just a provider. I need to feel like I still matter to you." His jaw tightened. "So, what do you want me to do? Quit my job? Stay home all day?" I shook my head, frustration rising. "I want you to see me, Ibrahim. To touch me, to make me feel like your wife again." Silence. I searched his face, hoping for some sign that my words had reached him. But all I saw was exhaustion and something else. Indifference. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but cold. "I don't have time for this." He turned away, heading for the bathroom, leaving me standing there, heart aching, hands clenched at my sides. I had tried. I had given him the chance to fight for us. And he had walked away. Again. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, a realization settled deep in my bones. If Ibrahim wasn't willing to fight for this marriage, I wasn't sure how much longer I could fight alone. I wasn't expecting to run into him, especially not here, in the middle of a crowded supermarket. But there he was, standing in front of the dairy aisle, casually picking up a carton of milk, as if it was the most normal thing in the world. The moment I saw him, my heart skipped a beat, and for a brief second, the world around me seemed to blur. There was something about George, something magnetic, that made my pulse race. I tried to act calm, pretending I didn't notice him, but my feet had already carried me toward him. "Amina?" His voice was low, warm, like a secret only I was meant to hear. He turned, his eyes lighting up in recognition. His gaze lingered on me for a beat longer than it should have, and I felt a warmth spread through me. "George," I managed to say, trying to keep my voice steady, though inside I was anything but calm. My breath was shallow, my palms slightly clammy. How could I feel this way, just from seeing him again? We exchanged pleasantries, our words easy, as if the months that had passed since we last spoke didn't exist. But underneath it all, I could feel the tension between us, the unspoken pull. My mind was screaming at me to step back, to avoid the temptation that had already begun to stir inside me. But my body wanted this. "You look beautiful," George said, his eyes darkening for a moment before he quickly added, "as always." His compliment hit me harder than I expected. I wasn't used to hearing those words from anyone these days. Not from Ibrahim. And certainly not in a place like this, surrounded by cans of soup and boxes of cereal. I felt my cheeks flush, and I couldn't help but smile. A soft, self-conscious smile that betrayed how much I was enjoying this attention. How hungry I was for it. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice barely above a breath. He took a small step closer, the air between us thick with something unsaid. I could feel his gaze trace the curve of my body, lingering at the places I knew were no longer as firm or youthful as they once had been. But still, the way he looked at me made me feel alive. A sharp, almost painful ache started to stir inside me, deep in my chest. The desire, the longing, was overwhelming, and I couldn't deny it. Not anymore. I wanted him. And the worst part? I wanted him more than I had ever wanted anything in my life. I took a breath, trying to steady myself, but it only seemed to make things worse. The sound of his voice, his closeness, his presence, it was all too much. His lips parted, and I swore I could see the flicker of temptation in his eyes. I looked at him then, really looked at him, and for the first time I noticed how much he was not like Ibrahim. There was no distance, no coldness, no indifference in George's gaze. But then the sharp sting of reality hit me like a slap in the face. I was married. I had a husband, even if he barely knew I existed anymore. My heart twisted painfully in my chest. But does he even care anymore? I stepped back, just a little, fighting to regain control of my spiraling emotions. I couldn't do this. I couldn't let myself fall into this. "George, I started, but the words felt tangled in my throat, as if my body didn't want to resist anymore. Before I could finish, he took another step forward, closing the gap between us. His hand brushed mine lightly, the touch so brief, yet so electrifying that it felt like it had seared into my skin. "Amina," he murmured, his voice low, almost a whisper. "If you need someone, I'll always be here." Those words, "always be here," tore through me. Why does he make it sound so easy? I looked at him, trying to hold onto the last sliver of resolve I had left. I needed to walk away, to find some semblance of control, to remind myself who I was. But standing there, feeling the heat of his body so close to mine, my mind. I should have said no. I should have fought the urge, ignored the loneliness, buried the hunger deep inside me where it couldn't breathe, couldn't grow. But when Ibrahim called that evening to tell me his trip to Abuja had been extended, something inside me broke. I had expected it, the indifference in his tone, the lack of apology, the way he said, "I'll be back in a week," as if it made no difference whether he came home or not. And maybe it didn't. Maybe I had already been living alone for months, my husband merely a shadow in our home. So when I ended the call, my fingers hesitated over my phone screen, my mind battling itself. But my heart, my body, already knew what it wanted. I sent the message before I could change my mind. "Come over." George arrived barely 20 minutes later. I had been standing in front of the mirror, smoothing down my silk nightdress, telling myself that I was only inviting him over for company. Nothing more. But when I opened the door and saw him standing there, his eyes dark with something unspoken, I knew we had already crossed the line. He stepped inside, his presence filling the space, filling me in a way I hadn't felt in so long. I closed the door behind him, my heartbeat a wild, uncontrollable thing in my chest. "You shouldn't be here," I whispered, my voice trembling. He took a step closer. "Then why did you invite me?" I had no answer. Or maybe I did, but it wasn't something I could admit out loud. The silence between us was electric, charged with all the things we had left unsaid. His eyes dropped to my lips, then lower, taking in the curve of my body, the way my nightdress clung to me. "George," I started, but my voice broke when he reached out, his fingers grazing my arm. The touch was light, barely there, but it ignited something in me, something raw, something desperate. "Amina," he murmured, his voice low, reverent. His hand slid to my waist, pulling me against him. His body was warm, solid, so different from the cold emptiness I had grown used to. I knew I should stop this. I should step away, push him back, remind myself that I was still Ibrahim's wife. But when George's lips brushed against mine, soft at first, hesitant, testing, I didn't pull away. I melted. A quiet moan escaped me as he deepened the kiss, his hands firm on my hips, pressing me closer. The heat between us was unbearable, consuming, a fire that had been waiting to be lit for too long. I felt his breath hitch as my fingers tangled in his hair, as if he, too, had been starving for this moment. "Tell me to stop," he whispered against my lips. I should have. But instead, I whispered back, "Don't stop." And he didn't. When it was over, we lay tangled in the sheets, our bodies slick with sweat, our breaths uneven. George's fingers traced lazy patterns on my bare skin, his touch lingering, worshipping. I should have felt guilty. I should have been drowning in regret, in shame. But I wasn't. I felt alive. For the first time in so long, I felt wanted, cherished. I felt like a woman again. Not just a forgotten wife, not just a mother-to-be. George kissed my forehead, his lips soft and lingering. "Are you okay?" I turned to look at him, my heart still racing. Yes. And for the first time in a long time, I truly meant it. Life has a strange way of shifting the tides just when you think you've figured it out. For months, I had craved Ibrahim's attention, longed for his touch, ached for the love he used to shower me with. And when I finally gave up, when I found comfort in George's arms, Ibrahim suddenly came back to me. The irony of it all was almost laughable. The day our son was born, something in Ibrahim changed. He held the tiny bundle in his arms with tears in his eyes, his voice thick with emotion as he whispered, "Thank you, Amina. Thank you for giving me a son." In that moment, He became the man I had married, the attentive, affectionate husband who once made me feel like I was his entire world. He was home earlier than ever now, fussing over me, over our baby, buying gifts, showering us with love. He wanted to hold me, touch me, kiss me. He wanted us back. But something had changed in me. My body, my mind, my heart. All of it now belonged to my baby. When Ibrahim tried to pull me close at night, I was too exhausted from feeding and rocking our son to sleep. When he whispered soft words against my skin, my mind was too occupied with diapers and feeding schedules. When he bought me perfumes, jewelry, expensive clothes, I barely glanced at them. And now, for the first time, it was his turn to feel ignored. "Amina, we need to talk," Ibrahim said one evening as I cradled our son in my arms, rocking him gently. I barely looked up. He sighed, running a frustrated hand through his hair. "You're different. You don't even see me anymore." I turned to him then, my brows furrowing. "What are you talking about? You act like I don't exist." His voice rose slightly before he quickly lowered it, not wanting to wake the baby. Amina. I try so hard to make things right, but it's like you don't care." I exhaled, suddenly exhausted by the conversation. "Ibrahim, I just had a baby. My entire life has changed. I don't have time to think about romance or intimacy. I barely have time for myself." He sat down beside me, his eyes searching mine. "I understand that, but I miss my wife. I miss you. I love our son, but I don't want to lose us in the process." I looked away, guilt creeping into my chest. How could I tell him that it wasn't just the baby that had changed things? How could I tell him that in the months he had ignored me, my heart had found comfort elsewhere? That even now, as he begged for my attention, a part of me still thought of George? Ibrahim reached for my hand, his touch warm and familiar. "Please, Amina, don't shut me out." I swallowed hard, forcing a small smile. "I'm trying." He nodded, but the sadness in his eyes told me he wasn't convinced. And deep down, neither was I. Life, as unpredictable as it is, has a way of bringing us full circle. Ibrahim and I found our way back to each other. Slowly, carefully, we rebuilt what we had lost. It wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, of hesitation, of guilt. But we chose to fight for our marriage, to rediscover the love that had once held us together.
It took time.
Intimacy had to be relearned, trust had to be rebuilt, and I had to open my heart again. But in the end, we found our rhythm, and life resumed its beautiful, imperfect normalcy. George? He faded into the past like a dream, intense, fleeting, but ultimately not meant to last. Now, I turn to you, my audience. Have you ever found yourself in a situation like mine? Feeling neglected, unseen, longing for something more? If so, how did you handle it? Do you think I made the right choices, or would you have done things differently? Let's talk. Let's share. In comment section. Because sometimes, the answers we seek are found in the experiences of others.